Okay, now we're going to look at heart failure. Heart failure we're going to describe as basically a failure of a pump. And the pump we're going to be talking about is the left ventricle. This is the main chamber that pumps blood throughout the body, and the blood has to leave the left ventricle and be pumped to the body, and it's pumped out of the main artery, the aorta, which arises from the left ventricle extending superiorly, and that's what we're seeing right here. And we can all envision that if we're not getting blood pumped out of the left ventricle into the aorta, we're going to have a host of problems. But for today, let's talk about what happens to that blood that doesn't get pumped out. And basically what happens is that blood backs up. So if we think about where does that blood back up and what does it mean and what does it cause and what happens, we'll go through that. So if the blood backs up from the left ventricle, it's going to back up into some structure called the left atrium, and I'm going to make this more as a diagram, but let's make a connection right here. And what we'll do is we'll draw in a left atrium that is connected to the left ventricle. This is again diagrammatic for purposes, and the left atrium sits here. So if we think about it, normally we want to have our blood flowing in this direction from the left ventricle into the aorta and into the main vessels that feed from the aorta, but in our case now our left ventricle is not pumping satisfactorily and the blood is going to back up, and it's going to back up into this structure we're going to call the left atrium. So I'll abbreviate that left, and that's atrium. And so let's see what happens when that blood backs up into the left atrium. What does it cause and what does it look like? All right, so I've made a new drawing here, a diagram really of the left atrium. So what's going to happen? Well, that blood has backed up into the left atrium, and we're going to see increased volume in the left atrium, so that volume will be going up. And so what will happen? Well, the vessels that drain into the left atrium are going to get distended because that blood is going to back up further, and it's going to back up into these feeding channels which had been bringing blood into the left atrium, and those are pulmonary veins. So we will see the pulmonary veins getting enlarged or distended, and we'll call that pulmonary venous hypertension. Pulmonary venous hypertension, if I've spelled that right. Okay, so pulmonary venous hypertension, and those will be features that we might see on a chest x-ray. So if we had an x-ray of our friend here and his heart's not working well, what would we see? Well, let's draw out our friend over here. We got some lungs. We'll draw in the other side, and we'll make these look pretty much, we'll make these look pretty good. Maybe we'll change the color here just to draw our heart here in the middle. Okay. Alright, so let's ask ourselves, what do we see if these pulmonary veins that we described here start getting distended and start getting enlarged? What do we see? Well, we'll see something on the x-ray. We'll see these antler type enlarged veins extending into the upper lung fields. I mean, they'll look big, they'll look distended. Sometimes we'll call this cephalization, but we see big, engorged, dilated pulmonary veins extending up into the upper lung fields. Now we can see them in other areas too, but the ones that extend superiorly are the ones that really stand out. So again, what do we call this? We're going to call this pulmonary venous hypertension, and I'll just abbreviate that, pulmonary venous hypertension. And that is a feature of the enlarged, dilated pulmonary veins, which are now distended because the blood has backed up from the left ventricle, which we saw previously, into the left atrium, and now it's backing up in the left atrium into the pulmonary veins, and we're seeing these big distended pulmonary veins extending into the upper lungs if we looked at a chest x-ray. So if we looked at our friend's lungs here under a microscope, we would see this octagon-shaped or pyramidal-shaped pulmonary tissue, and what we're seeing here is the lung tissue, and these boxy areas here, those are the walls of the air spaces or the alveoli, and those pulmonary veins run in those walls. So as those dilated big pulmonary veins that we saw on the chest x-ray back up further and further, what we'll see is these distended pulmonary veins extending into the walls that we can actually see on the x-ray, and if we looked at it under a microscope, on the microscope, because those walls become thickened and they get excess fluid in the walls, and we'll call that edema. And this tissue, these walls of the airspace here, are called the pulmonary interstitium, and this edema developing because of heart failure is called pulmonary interstitial edema. That was pulmonary interstitial edema. So what we'd see this pulmonary interstitial edema, and I've written it out here. And so what would that look like? Well, we'd see it under the microscope, but could we see it on the x-ray? And yes, we can see it on the x-ray. And we'll see these little fine lines, horizontal lines extending from the periphery of the lung, and we'll see them on both sides, and that's that interstitial edema extending along that pulmonary tissue, and we can see that on the x-ray, and we'll see some of it in here closely along with those distended pulmonary veins. As that heart failure gets worse and worse, the patient will progress clinically and radiographically. So we'll see those distended pulmonary veins, that pulmonary venous hypertension we talked about, but now we'll start to see that interstitial edema, that thickening of the interstitial and fluid building up there. So what will happen if the heart failure worsens? Well, we've already got that blood backing up. It's backing up into the pulmonary veins. From the left atrium, it's backing up from the pulmonary veins into the walls of the alveoli, into the air spaces, and giving us that interstitial edema. Well, what if it backs up further? Well, then fluid and edema, that fluid starts leaking out into the air spaces, and we start getting these areas of alveolar edema or airspace edema, where that's really fluid that's oozing into the airspace. And we can see that on a chest x-ray as well. It'll look like this cloud-like edema pattern developing in the lungs centrally, all throughout the mid portion of the lungs and extending into the upper lung field. So we're going to change that name. That's a worsened type of edema. So instead of calling that interstitial edema, we're going to call that pulmonary alveolar edema or airspace edema. Alveolar edema. So that's our progression. We've seen the heart fail, the left ventricle's not pumping, the blood backs up into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it backs up into the pulmonary veins, and we get the distended pulmonary veins that we're talking about. As it backs up further and further, we'll see that interstitial edema. We can see that on the x-ray. We could see that if we looked at the microscope. We could see it as well. And then if it backs up further, we get that fluid, that edema flooding out into the airway, and we get that alveolar edema.